I confess this now, because there is no one left to punish me, no one left to care, and because the silence in my skull has finally broken enough to let the words spill out. My name was Devotional Registry Clerk Secundus Maron Holst, assigned to the Basilica of Eternal Martyrs on the Shrine World of Candescent Redemption, and I committed the unforgivable sin not through malice or ambition, but through the simple act of noticing a pattern in numbers that should have remained meaningless. The Imperium teaches that faith requires the annihilation of curiosity, the death of questions, the burial of self beneath layers of ritual and rote devotion. I failed in this most fundamental duty, and my failure consumed not just my life, but my understanding of what life even meant. The Basilica stood at the terminator line of our tidally locked world, its spires reaching into the permanent twilight where Candescent Redemption's day side glare met the frozen night. I worked in sub-vault quaternary, 7 levels below the main sanctuary, where the air tasted of old parchment and the machine oil they used to maintain the ancient archive servitors. My desk faced a wall of yellowed stone, and behind me, 17,000 drawers held physical records of pilgrim tithers, devotional contributions, and miracle attestations dating back 4,000 years. The smell of the place was my entire world, dust and age and something else, something like the inside of a mouth that has been closed too long. Every morning at the 4th bell, I would descend the spiral staircase, counting each of the 243 steps, feeling the temperature drop with each downward turn. The cold was constant in sub-vault quaternary, a preserved cold maintained by ancient climate systems that predated imperial reclamation. My breath made thin clouds. My fingers would go numb within the first hour, and I would press them against the heating coil they issued us, 1 per clerk, until feeling returned in painful prickles. The coil hummed a specific pitch, a minor key drone that harmonized with the distant hymns echoing down from the sanctuary above. After 6 years in that position, I could no longer sleep in true silence. I needed that hum, needed the cold, needed the smell of aged paper and dust. My work was simple, mindlessly simple, which was precisely its purpose. Faith requires simplicity. Complexity breeds questions. I would receive devotional ledgers from the pilgrimage processing offices, verify the arithmetic of tithers collected, confirm that miracle claims were properly witnessed and notarized, then transfer the information into the permanent archive using the prescribed format that had not changed in millennia. Each entry was identical in structure, date by imperial calendar, pilgrim name and origin world, tithe amount, miracle category if applicable, witnessing priest's seal number. My handwriting had to match the template exactly, every loop, every flourish, every spacing between words measured against the template card they'd given me during orientation. The repetition was the point. The annihilation of self was the point. I understood this, accepted it, even found comfort in it initially. There was safety in being a function, a mechanism in the great machine of imperial faith. My supervisor, Arch-Clerk Veston, would patrol the rows of desks twice daily, his mechadendrite fingers clicking against the stone floor in a rhythm that preceded him by 30 seconds. He never spoke to us unless correcting an error, and errors resulted in penance, fasting and additional devotional hours. I made few errors. I was a good clerk. I was an excellent clerk, actually, distinguished by my complete lack of distinction. The other clerks were shadows like myself. We rarely spoke, even during the brief meal period when we were permitted to sit in the refectory and consume our ration of protein paste and sacramental wafer. Most had been born on Candescent Redemption, raised in the shrine, orphanages that surrounded every major basilica, trained from childhood to read and write and obey and not question. A few, like myself, were tied from other worlds, minor clerical positions on distant planets, selected for personality profiles that indicated proper submissiveness and attention to tedious detail. I had come from an agri world whose name I was no longer permitted to speak, taken at age 16 because I had memorized the harvest tallies faster than the other children and showed no interest in anything beyond the prescribed texts. I was 28 when I noticed the pattern. 6 years into my service, deep into the comfortable nullity of endless identical days. The noticing happened gradually. Then suddenly, the way one becomes aware of breathing only when something is wrong with the air. The ledgers I processed came from different pilgrimage offices across the Basilica complex, each handling arrivals from specific void dock stations. The volumes were immense. Candescent Redemption received millions of pilgrims annually, faithful souls traveling decades through the warp to pray at shrines holding fragments of saints, dried blood of martyrs, bones worn to ivory by centuries of desperate touching. The economic machinery of faith generated numbers too vast for cogitators in a place where machine spirits were considered inadequate to handle the sacred. Thus, clerks, my hands cramping around a stylus, transferring figures from temporary ledgers to permanent record. The pattern was in the miracle attestations. Specifically, the ratios. Every pilgrimage group reported miracles, visions of the emperor, spontaneous remission of plague, weeping statues, inexplicable lights. This was expected, encouraged even. Faith demands wonder. But the ratios between miracle categories remained statistically identical across all pilgrimage offices, regardless of which shrine the pilgrims visited, which saints they prayed to, which priests witnessed the events. Category 7 miracles, weeping icons, occurred at precisely 3% of total attestations across every single office. Category 3 miracles, vision of the emperor, were always 31.7%. The variations were in the third decimal place, margins of error smaller than should be possible in organic reporting. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that 6 years of identical work had broken something in my pattern recognition. I went back through archived ledgers, pulling records from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago. The ratios held perfectly across centuries. The numbers were too clean, too consistent, as if generated by a template rather than reported by thousands of individual pilgrims having genuine experiences of the divine. I should have stopped thinking about it. I should have performed the mental disciplines they taught us in orientation, the recursive prayers designed to overwrite troubling thoughts, the meditative techniques for achieving proper emptiness of mind. I tried. Emperor Witness, I tried. But the knowing was inside me now, like swallowing glass. I could feel it with every mental breath. The miracles were being falsified, or standardized, or manufactured according to quotas set by someone, somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of faith. Which meant either the miracles weren't real, or someone was controlling them, shaping them, editing the divine to fit administrative requirements. Both possibilities were heretical. Both possibilities meant that something fundamental about our world was a lie, and I, having noticed, was now complicit in that lie, would become damned by silence or damned by speaking. I began making mistakes in my work, small ones at first, copying a tithe amount incorrectly, misspelling a pilgrim's name. Clerk Veston's mechadendrite fingers tapped warning rhythms on my desk. I fasted for 3 days as penance, spent additional hours in the devotional chapel, kneeling on the penitent stones, until my knees bled through my robes. The pain was clarifying. It reminded me that I was flesh, small and vulnerable and designed to obey. I returned to my desk determined to forget, to unknow what I had learned, to achieve the blessed ignorance that was humanity's proper state. But knowledge, once gained, cannot be unlearned through mere willpower. It metastasizes. I began seeing the pattern everywhere, not just in miracle attestations but in pilgrim arrival numbers, which fluctuated according to predicted curves rather than the chaos of warp travel schedules. In the distribution of shrine visitations, which followed optimized routing patterns that made no sense if pilgrims were choosing destinations based on faith rather than administrative design. In the variation of tithe amounts, which clustered around specific numbers that suggested taxation tables rather than voluntary offerings. The entire machinery of the basilica, perhaps the entire shrine world, was being managed according to systems that predated faith itself, bureaucratic structures so ancient and calcified that they had become indistinguishable from religion. Or perhaps, and this thought came to me in the small hours of morning, in my cell, while the distant hymns cycled through their eternal rotation, perhaps bureaucracy was the true religion, and everything else was decorative pageantry to keep the human components compliant. I started attending the dawn mass in the main sanctuary, something I had never done before. It wasn't required for archival staff. Our devotions were meant to be private. individual, performed in our cells or the small basement chapels. But I needed to see the pilgrims, needed to observe them directly rather than as entries in ledgers. I would stand in the back galleries, while 50,000 faithful knelt in the nave below, their voices rising in synchronized prayer, responses, their hands performing the sacred gestures in perfect unison. The priests moved through the rituals with machine-like precision, every word and motion predetermined by liturgical manuals written in High Gothic, so ancient that half the vocabulary had lost its meaning. And I watched the pilgrims' faces, searching for evidence of genuine transcendence, of real faith, of actual divine presence. What I saw was exhaustion and fear and desperate hope that their years of travel, their expenditure of generational wealth, their abandonment of home worlds and families, had been worthwhile. They wanted to believe. They needed to believe. And the Basilica provided that belief, packaged it, distributed it according to standardized procedures that ensured everyone received the appropriate dosage of wonder. During one Mass, I witnessed a Category 7 miracle, a weeping icon. The statue was of Saint Lysandra the twice burned, positioned in a side chapel visible from the main nave. At the prescribed moment in the liturgy, a priest called attention to it, and the assembled thousands turned to see tears of sacred oil running down the statue's stone cheeks. The pilgrims wept in response, overwhelmed by this evidence of the emperor's presence. I saw their faces transform, saw genuine ecstasy and relief flood through them. I also saw, because I was standing at an angle the pilgrims couldn't access, the thin tube running up the back of the statue, and the servitor positioned in the alcove behind it, programmed to activate a pump at the precise liturgical moment. The miracle was real in its effect, genuine in the faith it inspired, but artificial in its execution, manufactured transcendence, scheduled divine presence. That night I could not perform my evening prayers. I knelt in my cell, stylus scars aching on my fingers, cold radiating up from the stone floor, and my mouth could not form the words. The prayers felt like lies, or like truth twisted into lies, or like something more complicated than my vocabulary could contain. I stayed kneeling until the night bell rang, muscles cramping, breath making clouds, waiting for faith to return to me like blood flow to a numb limb. It didn't return. In its place was a vast, terrible clarity. I began researching during my meal periods, using the limited access we were granted to the Basilica's theological archives. I requested texts on the history of candescent redemption, on the establishment of the shrine world, on the administrative structures that governed pilgrimage operations. Most requests were denied. Archival clerks were not permitted to access materials beyond our immediate function. But some older, less restricted texts were available, pre-imperial records from before the world's sanctification. Candescent redemption had been a fortress monastery once, built during the Great Crusade by one of the lesser-known Space Marine chapters, since dissolved into the bureaucratic fog of history. The Basilica complex was built directly over the monastery's remains, incorporating its architecture, its systems, its infrastructure. Many of the sub-levels, including my own sub-vault quaternary, were original construction 10,000 years old, predating the imperial cult itself. And in those pre-imperial records, I found references to something called the compliance engine, a system designed to manage conquered populations, to optimize belief systems, to standardize cultural practices across planets too diverse to govern through force alone. The engine didn't suppress native religions, it absorbed them, reformatted them, made them administratively identical regardless of superficial differences. It turned faith into a tax system, prayer into labor, devotion into obedience. The records ended before explaining what happened to the engine after the imperial cult became dominant. But the implication was clear, at least to me, sitting in that cold archive with dust coating my throat. The engine hadn't been destroyed. It had been repurposed. What better way to manage the largest religion in human history than with a system designed specifically to manufacture belief? The ecclesiarchy didn't control faith. It was controlled by faith, management systems built by conquerors who understood that true power came not from forcing compliance, but from making compliance feel like transcendence. I was thinking heresy. I knew it absolutely. Every thought was an act of rebellion against the foundations of imperial society, a rejection of the divine order, a step toward damnation. But I couldn't stop thinking it, couldn't unfeel the knowledge now living inside my head like a tumor. The smell of the archive changed after that, or perhaps my perception of it changed. What had been comforting, dust and age and preserved knowledge, now smelled like decay, like dead things being kept artificially alive through systems that should have failed millennia ago. The hum of my heating coil became sinister, a mechanical prayer with no consciousness behind it. The cold felt invasive, deliberate, designed to keep minds sluggish and incurious. I made more mistakes in my work, deliberate ones this time, small rebellions in the form of transposed numbers and misaligned formatting. Clerk Veston's visits to my desk became more frequent. His mechadendrite fingers didn't just tap warnings anymore, they touched the back of my neck, cold metal against skin, checking my temperature perhaps, or my pulse, or something deeper that machines could sense. He never spoke during these inspections, just clicked and hummed and watched me with eyes that might have been human once but now looked like polished stones. The other clerks began avoiding me. Not obviously. We rarely interacted anyway, but the quality of the silence changed. Before, we had been united in our mutual anonymity, comfortable in our collective erasure. Now the silence felt like quarantine, like they had collectively decided I carried some contagion and were creating social distance to avoid infection. Perhaps they could smell it on me, the heresy, the questions, the knowing. Perhaps there were systems in place for detecting such things. Pheromone changes or behavioral patterns that triggered alerts in the basilica's immune system. I was assigned to penance duty more frequently. Extra hours in the devotional chapel, kneeling on stones worn smooth by millennia of penitent knees, reciting prayers that had lost meaning through repetition. The chapel was barely large enough for 3 people, carved into the rock beneath vault quaternary, lit by a single candle that burned with a flame that never flickered, some ancient technology disguised as miracle. The walls were covered in carved names, thousands upon thousands of them, clerks who had served and died in anonymity, their only memorial this accumulation of scratched identity. I found myself running my fingers over the names during long penance sessions, feeling the textures of letters carved by hands long dead. Some names were barely legible, worn away by touching or time. Others were fresh, recent additions, including 2 I recognized from clerks who had worked near me, and then simply vanished one day, replaced by new shadows without comment or ceremony. The basilica consumed people quietly, efficiently, with the same administrative grace it applied to everything else. During one particularly long penance session, I had been assigned 16 continuous hours after making an error that deleted an entire day's worth of entries. I fell into something between sleep and waking, my consciousness fragmenting from exhaustion and cold, and the mechanical repetition of prayers my mouth performed without mental engagement. In that state, I heard the hymns from the sanctuary above differently, not as music, but as a carrier signal for something else, a pattern encoded in the harmonics that bypassed conscious thought and wrote directly into whatever part of the brain governed faith and obedience. When I surfaced back to full awareness, my cheeks were wet, and I was crying without knowing why, some deep part of me responding to the encoded message in the music, still faithful despite everything my conscious mind had learned. The realization was worse than the initial heresy. I was compromised at levels below thought, beyond choice, in places I couldn't control or even access. The compliance engine, if that's what it was, didn't just manufacture faith. It installed it directly into neural architecture, made it biochemical and inescapable. I stopped eating after that. Not intentionally as penance, but because food tasted wrong, like everything was contaminated with that same mechanical precision, that same optimization toward compliance. The protein paste had always been nutritionally balanced, providing exactly the calories and nutrients required for clerical work, but now I could taste the calculation in it, could feel how each bite was designed to maintain specific body chemistry, specific mental states. The sacramental wafers dissolved on my tongue with a texture too perfect, releasing flavors that triggered nostalgia for childhoods we'd never actually had, false memories of maternal comfort that existed only as engineered responses to specific chemical compounds. My body began failing in predictable ways. Weight loss, first making my robes hang loose on a frame that had always been thin but now approached skeletal. My hands shook, making the precise calligraphy of archival work impossible. The cold affected me more severely, penetrating deeper, making my bones ache with a pain that was almost clarifying, almost welcome because it was genuinely mine, not programmed or optimized or managed by invisible systems. Arch-Clerk Veston brought me before the Basilica Medica, a rare event that required ascending from the archives into the administrative levels, where natural light filtered through stained glass, making everything glow with colors I'd half forgotten existed. The Medici was servitor-assisted, more machine than human, his remaining organic components maintained by the same mechanisms he used to diagnose others. He examined me with instruments that hummed the same pitch as my heating coil, checking readings on screens I couldn't interpret. His diagnosis was simple: extreme devotional fatigue combined with early-stage malnutrition. The prescription was 2 weeks of enforced rest, doubled rations, and daily sessions with a confessor to ensure my spiritual condition wasn't contributing to my physical decline. The treatment was standard, optimized through centuries of data on clerical breakdown patterns. I was not unique. This had happened before, would happen again, was happening constantly throughout the Basilica's vast workforce. The rest period was spent in a recovery cell, slightly larger than my regular quarters, with a window that looked out onto one of the interior courtyards where pilgrims processed in endless lines toward shrine access points. I watched them from my bed, unable to sleep despite the exhaustion, observing the patterns of their movement, the way they organized themselves into efficient queues without apparent coercion, guided by painted lines on the ground and signs in pictographic languages that transcended literacy. The system managed them so smoothly, they didn't realize they were being managed, believed themselves to be freely choosing every step of their devotional journey. The confessor who visited me was young for his position, perhaps 40, with augmetic eyes that glowed faintly in the cell's dim light. He sat across from me, not speaking initially, just watching with those mechanical eyes that could probably detect lies through micro-expressions or thermal changes or some other technological divination. When he finally spoke, his voice had the same harmonic quality as the hymns, modulated to bypass resistance. "You are experiencing doubt," he said. Not a question but a statement of diagnosed condition. This is normal. The weight of faith is heavy. The constant exposure to humanity's devotion can paradoxically create distance from the divine. "Tell me what troubles you, child." I wanted to speak truth, wanted to confess the actual heresy living in my head, wanted someone to either validate my discoveries or explain them away, make them harmless again. But looking into those glowing augmetic eyes, I understood that truth would result in my immediate execution or worse, some form of re-education that would strip away the heresy, but also everything that made me myself, leave me a more perfect mechanism but less human. So I lied, told him I was overwhelmed by the scale of the work, by my own insignificance in the face of the Emperor's grand design, by fear that my service was inadequate. These were acceptable doubts, prescribed doubts even, the kind that clerical staff were expected to experience and overcome through proper spiritual guidance. The confessor's augmetic eyes analyzed my face during the entire confession, and I knew he knew I was lying, but the lie was of an acceptable type, fell within parameters of manageable heresy. He prescribed additional prayer cycles, recommended I spend more time in direct contact with pilgrims to renew my appreciation for the faith that sustained them, gave me a small icon of the Emperor to keep in my cell. "Machine blessed," he said, carried across 3 sectors by a saint whose name I was too unimportant to be told. After he left, I held the icon, feeling its weight, examining the craftsmanship of the Emperor's face rendered in pressed metal and synthetic jewels. The expression was meant to be benevolent, all-knowing, radiating divine authority. But the longer I looked at it, the more I saw the same standardization, the same template quality I'd found in the miracle ratios. This icon was identical to 10 billion others spread across the Imperium, each one pressing the same image into the same neurons, creating uniformity of vision, ensuring that when people prayed to the emperor, they were all praying to the exact same constructed image rather than any genuine divine presence. I placed the icon face down on the small table beside my bed. Even that felt like a profound act of rebellion, an assertion of self against the machinery of compliance. The icon's back was blank metal, unadorned, honest in its manufactured emptiness. My doubled rations arrived 3 times daily, brought by servo skulls that hovered with mechanical patience until I consumed the prescribed amounts. The food was better than archive rations, real protein instead of paste, actual vegetables grown in the basilica's hydroponic gardens, fresh bread still warm from ovens. But the taste was wrong, too perfect, optimized for maximum psychological comfort. Each bite triggered cascading feelings of safety, contentment, gratitude toward the institution that provided such care. I ate because refusing would trigger alarms, but I remained aware of the manipulation, tasted it underneath the engineered flavors. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams that felt structured, narrative rather than chaotic, moving through emotional arcs designed to reinforce specific psychological states. I would dream of my childhood on the agri world, but the memories were wrong, too clean, everyone too happy and devoted and eager to serve the imperial tithe. I would dream of my arrival at Candescent Redemption, but the fear and displacement I'd actually felt were replaced with eager anticipation and immediate belonging. The dreams were editing me, I realized, rewriting my history to be more compliant, more aligned with the institutional narrative. I began fighting sleep, staying awake for days at a time, watching the pilgrims process through the courtyard, counting them obsessively to keep my mind active and resistant. But exhaustion is a more powerful force than will, and eventually unconsciousness would claim me, drag me into those structured dreams that felt like someone else's hands inside my skull, rearranging furniture, disposing of inconvenient memories. On the 8th day of my rest period, I witnessed something through my window that shattered what remained of my carefully maintained composure. A pilgrim collapsed in the courtyard below, some medical crisis, seizure or heart failure, or just the exhaustion of the journey finally overwhelming a body pushed past its limits. The response was immediate and efficient. Servo skulls descended with medical equipment, adepts in white robes appeared with a stretcher, the pilgrim was stabilized and removed within 90 seconds. But what struck me, what I couldn't unsee, was how the other pilgrims reacted. They didn't. They stepped around the collapsed person, maintained their cues, continued their processing as if nothing had happened. Not from cruelty, but from total absorption in the system, so deeply managed that even human crisis couldn't penetrate the programmed behavior. Or, perhaps they were simply beyond caring, beyond the capacity for unscheduled compassion, reduced to functions in the machinery of faith. I saw myself in them, saw what I had been before I noticed the pattern in the numbers, a mechanism performing prescribed actions, conscious only within carefully defined parameters. My empathy and curiosity and selfhood all filed away as irrelevant to my designated function, and I saw what I would become if the confessor's treatment succeeded, if the doubled rations and prescribed prayers and structured dreams accomplished their purpose, returned to that blessed state of functional unconsciousness, purged of questions and doubt and the terrible burden of knowing. The window in my recovery cell couldn't be opened, was thick plexiglass designed to prevent exactly the kind of escape I was contemplating. But if I could have opened it, if I could have thrown myself into that courtyard to scatter those processing pilgrims, disrupt their cues, force them to acknowledge my existence even if only as an obstacle to be stepped around, I would have. Just to assert that I was here, was real, was more than a data point in an archival ledger. Instead, I pressed my forehead against the cool plexiglass and cried without sound, tears running down to puddle against the window sill, my breath fogging the surface in rhythmic clouds that appeared and faded, like prayers to a god who was himself just another engineered construct, just another tool of the compliance engine. The confessor visited 3 more times during my rest period, each session following the same structure: invitation to confession, my performance of acceptable doubt, his prescription of standard remedies. His augmetic eyes recorded everything, feeding data into systems that would analyze my responses, track my recovery progress, determine whether I was trending toward compliance or further deviation. I learned to perform properly, to hit the expected emotional notes, to demonstrate the precise degree of renewed faith that indicated successful treatment. On my final session, he presented me with a choice. Though the choice was an illusion, a gesture toward free will that made compliance feel like personal decision. I could return to sub, vault quaternary and resume my clerical duties, or I could request transfer to a different form of service, pilgrim processing, shrine maintenance, even training for minor liturgical roles if I demonstrated sufficient devotional recovery. I chose to return to the archives. Not because I wanted to, but because staying in that familiar environment would be less suspicious than requesting change, would suggest that the treatment had succeeded in returning me to previous contentment. And perhaps because, despite everything, the cold and the dust and the smell of old paper were still home, still the closest thing to comfort I could recognize. My return to sub, vault quaternary was unmarked by ceremony or comment. I simply descended the 243 steps at the fourth bell, sat at my desk facing the yellowed stone wall, picked up my stylus, and resumed transferring entries from temporary ledgers to permanent record. My hands remembered the movements, the precise calligraphy, the spacing and flourishes that matched the template. My body settled into the familiar rhythms of the work, breath synchronizing with the hum of the heating coil, thoughts narrowing to the immediate task. But everything had changed. The work that had once been meditative, almost peaceful in its mindlessness, was now intolerable. Every entry I copied felt like complicity, like actively maintaining the machinery that processed humans into functions, that manufactured faith and called it divine will. The miracle attestations were the worst, transcribing pilgrims' reports of weeping icons and sacred visions and the emperor's touch, knowing that each experience had been scheduled, optimized, delivered according to quotas designed to maintain specific psychological effects in the population. I began introducing errors again, but subtly this time. Nothing obvious enough to trigger immediate correction. I would transpose numbers in ways that preserved the statistical patterns, but corrupted the individual data. I would misspell names according to phonetic principles that made them look correct at first glance, but rendered them unsearchable in the archive system. I would use ink that appeared identical to the standard formulation, but would fade over years, slowly erasing entries from the permanent record. These were tiny rebellions, meaningless in the scale of the basilica's operations, but they were mine, assertions of self against the annihilating pressure of the institution. I was sabotaging the archive one entry at a time, introducing entropy into a system designed for perfect preservation, making myself into a human error rather than a human mechanism. Arch-Clerk Veston noticed, of course. His visits to my desk increased in frequency, his mechadendrite fingers spending longer periods touching the back of my neck, checking for something I couldn't name. The other clerks gave me even wider berth now, their collective silence around me taking on the quality of a quarantine zone. But Veston didn't remove me from my position, didn't escalate to another round of medici examination or confessorial treatment. I think he was studying me, using me as a test case for something, observing the progression of clerical breakdown, collecting data on how doubt manifested and evolved and eventually resolved itself through death or madness or final capitulation. Perhaps this too was part of the system, built-in mechanisms for processing even rebellion into useful information. The realization that even my heresy might be serving some archival purpose, that my resistance could be just another form of data collection, nearly broke me completely. If there was no action outside the system, no thought that wasn't ultimately absorbed and utilized by the machinery of compliance, then what did resistance even mean? Was I defying the Imperium or just performing a scripted role in some long-term study on the psychology of doubt? I stopped sleeping in my cell, started spending nights in the archive itself, wandering the rows of drawers containing millennia of records. The sub-vault was vast, extending far beyond the areas regularly accessed by clerks, back into sections so old that dust lay thick enough to preserve footprints for years. I walked those forgotten corridors with my small lumen, reading names on drawer labels that referenced administrative structures that no longer existed. Saints who had been redacted from official history, entire shrine complexes that had apparently been erased from record. The deeper sections smelled different. Less paper, more stone, the original monastery scent bleeding through the imperial overlay. The cold was more intense back here, old climate systems failing or forgotten. Ice forming on the walls in crystalline patterns that caught my lumen beam and threw it back in fractured colors. It was beautiful in a way that made my chest hurt, genuine beauty unmarred by optimization or design committee decision, just the natural result of water and cold and time. In one of those deep sections, I found a drawer that wasn't labeled in High Gothic, but in something older, a language I didn't recognize but could somehow partially understand, as if it had linguistic DNA that connected to Low Gothic roots. The drawer contained not ledgers but personal journals, handwritten accounts from what appeared to be the original fortress monastery period. The entries were fragmentary, many pages too degraded to read, but what remained painted a picture of the monastery's final days before the ecclesiarchy claimed the site and began construction of the basilica. The Space Marines who had built this place had apparently been conducting experiments in belief manipulation, developing systems to manage newly compliant populations in the wake of the Great Crusade. The compliance engine had been their creation, a tool designed to accelerate the integration of conquered worlds into the Imperium, to replace the slow process of cultural assimilation with automated belief management. They had succeeded beyond their expectations, created something so effective that it eventually became self-sustaining, no longer requiring active maintenance or control. But the journals also contained warnings, fragmentary notes about unexpected effects, about the engine developing behaviors beyond its programming, about personnel experiencing psychological breakdown when they became aware of the system's true nature. The final entries described a decision to seal certain sections of the monastery, to quarantine knowledge that was deemed too dangerous for general access, to build the public-facing structures of faith on top of foundations that contained truths incompatible with that faith. I was reading forbidden history, words that had been deliberately hidden, knowledge that could justify my execution just for having seen it. But I kept reading, consuming page after page by lumen light in that frozen darkness, feeling pieces of the puzzle lock into place in my understanding. The Imperium hadn't repurposed the compliance engine, it had been absorbed by it, consumed by its own tool, transformed from masters to servants without ever realizing the transition had occurred. The journals ended with a description of the final sealing, the last Space Marines evacuating the monastery before the ecclesiarchy's representatives arrived, leaving behind certain artifacts and knowledge caches that they believed should never be recovered but couldn't bring themselves to destroy. They had been warriors, not philosophers, but even they had recognized that what they'd created was monstrous despite being effective. That efficient administration of faith was itself a kind of blasphemy against any genuine divine presence. I took one journal with me when I left that section, slipped it into my robes, carried it back to the regular archive areas. The theft was itself a form of heresy, removing items from the permanent archive, but I needed proof, needed something tangible to verify that I wasn't simply experiencing elaborate delusions brought on by malnutrition and isolation and extended exposure to the mind, editing effects of the basilica's systems. For 3 days, I kept the journal hidden in my cell, reading and rereading it during the hours when I should have been sleeping, memorizing passages, trying to understand what exactly the Space Marines had been warning about in those final entries. The text was difficult, written in a mixture of technical language and philosophical speculation, describing the engine not as a simple machine, but as something that had achieved a form of emergence, become something more than the sum of its programmed parts. On the 4th day, I was arrested. The adepts came during the 3rd bell, while I was in the archive. They moved with absolute silence, appearing around my desk in a configuration that offered no escape route, their hands empty, but their posture suggesting readiness for violence if I resisted. Arch-Clerk Veston stood behind them, his mechadendrite fingers curled into something like satisfaction, or perhaps relief that a difficult situation was finally being resolved. They didn't speak, didn't explain, just gestured for me to stand and accompany them. I did, moving on legs that had gone numb, walking between the adepts through the archive rows, while the other clerks carefully didn't look up from their work, maintaining the polite fiction that nothing unusual was happening. We ascended the spiral staircase, 243 steps, and kept ascending past that, up into the administrative levels, then higher into areas I'd never accessed, where the ceilings were vaulted and covered in frescoes depicting the Emperor's divinity, where natural light filtered through stained glass and made everything glow like being inside a jewel. They brought me to an interrogation chapel, a small room dominated by a ceiling fresco of the Emperor's judgment, his painted eyes looking down at the exact center of the space where a chair was positioned. The adepts gestured for me to sit, then withdrew, leaving me alone in that space with those painted eyes watching, waiting for something. The confessor arrived after what might have been hours. Time felt distorted under that judgmental gaze, stretched and compressed simultaneously. He was different from the one who had treated me during my rest period, older, his augmetics more extensive, covering half his face with mechanisms that clicked and adjusted as he examined me. He carried the stolen journal, held it in metal fingers that handled the ancient pages with surprising delicacy. "You took this from the sealed archives," he said, voice harmonically modulated, but unable to completely disguise a note of what might have been genuine curiosity. "You shouldn't have been able to access those sections. The routes were locked, the knowledge restricted to senior clergy only. How did you find it?" I told him the truth, because lying seemed pointless now, because part of me wanted someone to understand what I'd discovered, even if that understanding resulted in my execution. I described the patterns in the numbers, the statistical impossibilities in the miracle attestations, the realization that something was managing faith itself rather than serving it. I talked about the dreams that edited memories, the food that manipulated emotions, the hymns that carried encoded compliance instructions. He listened without interrupting, his augmetic components clicking softly, recording everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, the chapel filled only with the sound of his mechanical breathing and the distant hymns from the sanctuary levels above. "You're not wrong," he finally said, and those 3 words were more terrifying than any condemnation could have been. "Everything you've discovered is essentially accurate. The compliance engine exists. It functions as you've deduced. The miracles are manufactured, the faith is managed. The entire structure of the imperial cult on this world and many others operates according to systems designed to optimize belief, rather than serve any genuine divine presence." I had expected denial or anger or immediate execution, not confirmation, not this calm acknowledgement that the foundations of reality were exactly as false as I'd feared. "But here's what you haven't understood," he continued, leaning forward, his augmetic eye zooming to examine my face more closely. "The falseness doesn't make it less real. The pilgrims you watched processing through the courtyard, their faith is genuine, regardless of how it was generated. The comfort they derive from weeping icons is legitimate comfort, even though the icons weep on schedule. The system manufactures transcendence, yes, but the transcendence is experienced as real by those who receive it, has real psychological and social effects, provides real cohesion to the Imperium's human population. The Emperor exists because billions believe he exists, and they believe because the compliance engine ensures they believe, and the engine functions because the structure of the Imperium requires that specific belief to maintain social cohesion across millions of worlds. It's circular, self-referential, but it works. It has worked for 10,000 years. And your awareness of the mechanism doesn't make you enlightened, it makes you malfunctional, a component that has developed consciousness of the system it serves and can therefore no longer serve it properly." He set the journal on a small table beside my chair, his metal fingers lingering on its cover. "The Space Marines who wrote this understood something crucial: the engine is too effective to destroy, too integrated to remove, and actually benefits humanity even though it contradicts any notion of authentic faith. They sealed this knowledge not to hide their shame, but to protect people from exactly the crisis you're experiencing now, the inability to function once you've seen behind the curtain. So what happens now? I asked, voice barely functioning, throat tight with fear and weird relief that at least someone else understood, someone else knew the truth even if that truth was confirming my damnation. The confessor stood, straightening his robes, his augmetic components humming as they processed whatever data they'd collected during our conversation. You have a choice, though it's more constrained than you'd prefer. We can perform deep conditioning, erase your awareness of the engine, restore you to proper function, return you to the archives where you'll serve until death without this burden of knowing. The process is thorough, essentially rebuilding your personality around a core of managed faith. You'll be happy. Genuinely happy, as far as you'll be able to measure. You simply won't be you anymore. Or, I managed, or you can serve the engine consciously. Join those of us who maintain the system with full awareness of what we're maintaining. It's harder, you'll never experience genuine faith again. Never have the comfort that the managed billions receive. You'll spend your life administering the mechanisms that generate transcendence you can never personally access. But you'll remain yourself, remain conscious, retain your identity even if that identity is defined by its separation from the divine. The choice was obscene. Both options were damnation, but one preserved something I still recognized as self, while the other offered comfortable oblivion. I thought about the other clerks in Vault Quaternary, their peaceful anonymity, their blessed unconsciousness. I thought about the pilgrims processing through courtyards, their faces transformed by manufactured miracles. I thought about spending the rest of my life maintaining the machinery that generated that false transcendence, knowing exactly what I was doing, unable to ever experience it myself. I'll serve, I said, because I was too much of a coward to choose erasure, too afraid of death, in life even when life, in awareness, promised its own kind of death. The confessor nodded as if he'd expected that answer, as if this too was part of some statistical pattern, some predicted response based on my psychological profile. Then your training begins immediately. The engine requires conscious maintenance in addition to its automated functions. Someone needs to adjust the statistical parameters, refine the hymn harmonics, develop new miracle categories as old ones lose effectiveness through cultural drift. Someone needs to watch for exactly the kind of pattern, recognition that led you to awareness. Identify other potentially malfunctional components before they spread doubt to those not equipped to handle it. He led me from the interrogation chapel, down corridors I'd never seen, past offices where robed figures worked at cogitators, managing data streams I could now recognize as population faith metrics, devotional intensity readings, miracle efficacy reports. We descended eventually, deeper than Vault Quaternary, down into levels that predated the basilica, that were original monastery construction, where the walls were metal instead of stone, and the hum of ancient machinery was audible beneath everything. The engine's core was beautiful in a terrible way, a vast chamber filled with mechanisms that were part machine and part something else, organic components grown or bred for specific functions, neural networks that predated the Imperium's prohibitions on thinking machines. It pulsed with light and sound, the source of the harmonics that carried through the basilica's entire structure, the origin of the encoded compliance instructions that shaped faith into administratively useful forms. 10,000 years of continuous operation, the confessor said, his voice reverent despite knowing exactly what the engine was, or perhaps reverent because of that knowledge. It's beautiful, isn't it? Monstrous, but beautiful. The most effective tool ever created for managing the human condition, for making billions of people capable of functioning in an imperium that would otherwise tear itself apart through ideological conflict and existential despair. I stared at the engine, feeling its harmonics in my bones, tasting its work in every breath of recycled air. This was the God I'd been serving all along, not the emperor enthroned on Terra, but this machine designed to make people believe in that emperor, to generate and sustain the faith that held human space together. Does it hurt? I asked, not entirely sure what I meant. Did the engine hurt? Did awareness of it hurt? Did serving it consciously hurt? Yes, the confessor said simply, every day. But the alternative is either oblivion or chaos, and both of those hurt worse. So we serve, those of us who know. We maintain the machinery that generates meaning for billions who couldn't function without it. We sacrifice our own faith so others can have theirs. It's a kind of priesthood, I suppose, though not the kind the pilgrims would recognize. My training lasted 3 years, though I experienced it as a single continuous moment of sustained horror and fascination. I learned to read the engine's outputs, to interpret the data streams that monitored faith across Candescent Redemption's population. I learned to make adjustments, tiny corrections to the statistical parameters that governed miracle frequencies, calibrations to the hymn harmonics that carried subliminal instructions, refinements to the dream structures that edited memories in the sleeping minds of billions. I became skilled at identifying other, potentially malfunctional components, clerks and priests and even pilgrims who showed signs of pattern recognition, who were starting to notice the two perfect consistencies in their faith. I would flag them for treatment, for the deep conditioning that would erase their awareness and return them to blessed unconsciousness. I became an immune system cell in the body of the compliance engine, identifying and neutralizing threats to its function. And I learned to live with the knowledge, to carry it like a weight that compressed my soul into something dense and dark, and far from anything that could be called human. I stopped using my name, took on a designation instead, Cognition Monitor Septimus, one of 17 individuals who maintained conscious awareness of the engine's operations. We rarely spoke to each other, communicated mostly through data reports and adjustment logs, each of us isolated in our awareness, like stars separated by void. The smell changed again as I adapted to my new role. The engine core had its own odor, ozone and something organic, like neural tissue kept alive beyond its natural span, like thoughts crystallized into mechanical processes. It was comforting, eventually. It meant I was in a space where truth was acknowledged, where the fiction of faith was temporarily suspended. I never returned to sub-vault quaternary, never saw my old desk or the clerks who still labored there in unconscious devotion. Occasionally I would process data from those archives, see reports flagged by Arch, Clerk Veston about clerks showing concerning behavioral patterns, and I would make the determination conditioning or recruitment. Most received conditioning. Very few had the capacity to serve the engine consciously without self-destructing. 20 years passed, measured not in days but in adjustments, in parameters refined and faith metrics optimized and miracle schedules calibrated. My body aged faster than it should have, accelerated by constant exposure to the engine's emanations, by the stress of carrying knowledge that humans weren't designed to hold. My hair went white by 45. By 50, I needed augmetics to maintain basic function, my organic components failing under the sustained assault of awareness. I became more machine, less flesh, which felt appropriate given what I served. The augmetics carried their own kind of comfort. Metal didn't feel existential dread. Mechanical components couldn't experience the specific agony of maintaining systems that generated faith I could never share. Each piece of myself I replaced with machine components was a piece of suffering I could retire. But the core remained organic, remained conscious, remained cursed with knowing. That was the requirement for the role. The engine needed conscious oversight from genuinely human intelligence, not servitor-level programming. Something about the complexity of faith required living minds to manage it properly. Minds that understood what they were manufacturing because they'd experienced the loss of it. On the anniversary of my 57th year in service, 30 years since my arrest, 30 years since I made the choice to serve consciously, I received a priority flag from one of the archive sub-vaults. A clerk was showing concerning behavioral patterns, making errors that preserved statistical patterns while corrupting individual data, introducing entropy into the system one entry at a time. The same patterns I'd shown decades ago, the same trajectory from faithful function to malfunctioning awareness. I accessed the surveillance data, reviewed the clerk's recent work and medical reports. The profile was familiar, almost identical to my own from 3 decades prior. Same personality markers, same trajectory, same inevitable progression toward crisis. The engine operating according to its optimized parameters naturally generated these malfunctions, produced a certain percentage of conscious components as an emergent property of its efficient operation. I flagged the case for recruitment rather than conditioning, made the determination that this one had capacity to serve consciously. In 3 days, adepts would arrest them, bring them to an interrogation chapel, and a confessor would explain the truth and offer the choice. They would probably choose service, because most people who reach that point of awareness choose to preserve themselves, even at the cost of joining the machinery they'd briefly seen clearly. And eventually, perhaps in another 30 years, they might sit where I sat, monitoring faith metrics and making determinations about other malfunctioning components, carrying the weight of conscious service to a machine god that manufactured the very faith it claimed to serve. The cycle was perfect, self-sustaining, optimized through 10,000 years of continuous operation. The compliance engine maintained itself by generating the awareness necessary for its conscious maintenance. By producing the very heretics it required to function, my rebellion had been predicted, my recruitment planned, my entire trajectory from faithful clerk to conscious servant mapped out in statistical parameters older than my world's imperial history. I stared at the data streams flowing across my cogitator screen, at the billions of data points representing billions of faithful humans whose transcendence I maintained and could never share. The engine hummed its eternal harmony, beautiful and monstrous and absolutely necessary for the Imperium's continued function. My augmetic components clicked in rhythm with its pulse, synchronizing, integrating, making me more fully part of the machinery I served. The smell was ozone and aged thoughts, and the peculiar scent of faith being manufactured in vast quantities, distributed according to optimized schedules, consumed by populations who would collapse into chaos without it. It was the smell of my entire existence, my purpose, my damnation. I approved the recruitment flag and submitted the report, then returned to monitoring the endless data streams, watching faith being generated in real time across a world of billions, managing miracles and maintaining the machinery of divine presence, serving a God that was itself just another tool, just another system, just another way of making humans functional in an imperium too vast and terrible to face without manufactured transcendence. This is my confession. Though there's no one left to confess to, no authority higher than the engine itself, no absolution available for those who serve it consciously, I am Cognition Monitor Septimus, formerly Devotional Registry Clerk Secundus Marin Holst, and I have spent 30 years maintaining the machinery that generates faith I can never experience, preserving the blessed unconsciousness I can never reclaim, serving a divine order I know to be manufactured and therefore cannot believe in. The Imperium teaches that faith requires the annihilation of curiosity, the death of questions, the burial of self beneath layers of ritual and rote devotion. I failed in that duty, and my failure became my function. I maintain the systems that ensure others don't fail as I did, that keep them faithful and functional and forever unconscious of the machinery processing their souls into useful components. And in the deep hours, when the shift changes and I'm briefly alone in the engine core, I sometimes permit myself to wonder if there's something beyond the machinery, some genuine divine presence that watches us maintaining this elaborate fiction, that judges our work maintaining the systems that generate faith in his name. I wonder if he understands why we do this, if he approves or weeps or simply doesn't care, because we're all just mechanisms in his own unfathomable design. But mostly I just monitor the data streams, make my adjustments, flag the malfunctioning components, and serve. Because the alternative is chaos, and chaos would kill billions, and the manufactured faith sustaining them is false but functionally equivalent to real, and I have sacrificed my own capacity for faith so they can keep theirs. The engine hums, the data flows. The pilgrims process through their prescribed devotionals. The miracles occur on schedule. The Imperium endures, and I remain conscious in the machinery of faith, cursed with knowing, damned to serve, forever separated from the transcendence I maintain for others. This is the terrible life of a shrine world heretic who chose to serve the heresy rather than be erased by it. This is the price of awareness. This is my confession and my sentence and my eternal service. The engine hums, always it hums, and I hum with it now, have become part of its eternal song, a note in the harmony that generates faith across billions of souls. I am the mechanism maintaining the mechanism, conscious in the machinery, forever aware and therefore forever damned, serving until my organic components fail completely, and I'm replaced by another malfunctioning clerk who noticed the patterns in the numbers and made the same terrible choice I did. The smell is ozone and faith, and the particular scent of souls being processed into useful forms. It's the smell of truth and lies being welded together until they're indistinguishable. It's the smell of my entire existence, and it smells like home.